Kentucky. It is October 30th, 1999, at the 53rd Annual Reunion of the 12th Armored Division. I would like to introduce Robert Van Eyck.
Von Esch, yes.
Van Esch, okay. And he was with the B Company of the 66th AIB. Let's get started by just telling me a little bit about where you were raised, your parents and your family.
Well, I was raised in East Los Angeles, and I went into the, actually enlisted in the service, but at that time, if you were already in college, you got sort of a deferment until supposedly you finished college, but that didn't happen, of course. And then I ultimately went to basic training in Tyler, Texas. It was a camp called Camp Fannin, and from there I got selected to go to the Texas A&M under the ASTP program, and of course from there to the 12th Armored Division.
What were your parents like? Did your mom and dad both work, or?
My mom did not work. My dad worked as a, I suppose, a machinist at the Union Pacific Railroad yards in Los Angeles, and of course at that time the railroads were the big thing, and the railroads would drive into the engines would drive into the yard, and they run a turntable, and the table would turn so that the various machinists could work on the engines at their particular station as they rotated them. But my mom always stayed home.
And how many siblings do you have?
I had one brother is only, and he was 2 years younger, and he went into the Navy.
Now, what made you decide to enlist as opposed to be drafted?
Well, I think most boys or men at that time, when they, of course, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, there was always that patriotic idea to want to join and get into the service, and I think that's what most of us did.
Where were you when Pearl Harbor was burned?
Well, I was that time living in Monterey Park, which is now primarily an Asian community in the Southern California area. And I don't recall whether I was at home or at school or where, but that's where I was living.
So shortly after that, that's when you enlisted?
I would say probably within a week or two. I certainly did enlist at that point.
What were you studying in college?
At that time I was taking engineering, and I don't know why. I've never really thought that great much about it, and I never went into engineering as a profession.
What did your father have any influence with you enlisting?
Influence in what?
In you enlisting in the...
No, I don't believe so. I believe it was just something that I just did on my own. I'm not sure that they were happy or unhappy about it. I don't recall any particular reaction.
So you're an engineering major, and how long were you in college before you were actually...
Well, actually, I'd been in high school, and I guess I went to summer school, so I got out of high school in 3.5 years, and then I went to a junior college in Pasadena called Pasadena Junior College, and I probably had, I'm just guessing, a year at that Pasadena Junior College before they called everybody in.
Did you have any interesting experiences in boot camp? Basic training?
Well, I never liked it, let me just say that. You know, it seemed like basic training was the type of thing where it just is too much exercise. In other words, you have calisthenics, and then you hope you'd have something that's a little relaxing, but then it's doing something else that's active. And I guess the thing that bothered me more than anything, I had never really been back east, at least not in the that part of Texas was very close to Louisiana. And of course, you had a lot of that, I'll call it, the swampland, but you had a lot of the chiggers and all of the bugs and the humidity, and that just didn't agree with me. And I was always hoping I would never be sent to Japan or those islands in the Pacific where they had a lot of that humidity and all of those bugs. So when I saw the train heading east, which I knew was to Europe, I felt much better about it.
Once you were in Tyler, where did you go from there?
From Tyler, I went to Texas A&M in the ASTP program.
And what did you study there?
Engineering.
And you were there for?
You know, I'm sure it was probably less than a year before they, terminated the program and put everybody in some military unit.
Then where did you go?
From there I went to Camp Barkley with the 12th Armored Division.
Do you have any interesting experiences at Camp Barkley?
Well, I can't think of anything that would stand out other than just the general thing you do in the military, you know. Get up early every morning and follow their program, and then at night clean your weapons and make sure all your clothes are pressed for the next morning.
What was your specialty in training?
In the military?
Mm-hmm.
Carrying a rifle.
Did you have any control over that, or was that just where they put you?
No, that's just the way it was, you know. They never ask you what, or at least they never asked me what I wanted to do. I'm sure I wouldn't have selected that.
Good. I was wondering also if you had any adverse reactions when you were on the train from one place to another.
You mean going from Camp Barkley to the East Coast?
Right.
No, I was very happy with it. I kind of liked knowing that I was going in that direction. I kind of thought that maybe I wouldn't because of having the German name. They might have thought I didn't want to, harm my kinfolk back there. And so I was very happy when I saw heading in that direction.
Did you get any leave time in New York City?
Yes, I did. I remember the whatever day it was that I had some leave time in New York City. Apparently they had I'll call it a semi-hurricane. It was raining like hell. I remember having to hang on to a light post to keep from being blown away. And so that's my experience there.
What about on the ship over? Did you get?
Oh, I didn't like that. It was on the Empress of Australia, which was a British ship. And of course that was, I guess, my first introduction to the English food. And I guess they served, that's what they cooked on that ship. And it was, you're just stacked 5 on top of another in these hammocks down below. And of course during the daytime you could come up and walk around, but there wasn't much to do. And I guess most people got kind of seasick, and so you really didn't feel like eating anyway. But it seemed like a very long journey over. And I learned later that's probably because they would use that zigzagging to avoid the submarines, but at the time they weren't telling you there was any fear of submarines, and it just seemed like a long haul over.
So you docked in, where did you dock in France?
In France it was Le Havre.
Yeah.
Yes. In England, because we went to England first, I think it was, I don't know, it was Portsmouth, or I think it was Portsmouth, but I'm not sure.
And you got new equipment once you got over there, didn't you?
You know, I don't recall that. All I recall is getting on the ship with everything packed on your back. And I don't recall, after we got to England, necessarily getting new equipment we may have, but I don't recall that. I just remember going to a tent city, and I remember after I got off the ship, they put you in kind of like these moving vans or semi-trailers, and you were standing up in there, and of course it was dark in there, and the first stop was at some Air Force base where they had lunch, and that seemed very good to us because they had fresh fruit, which you never saw again, but the Air Force apparently had special privileges.
Okay, so we're talking, what, about November?
I think we're talking about, you mean when we got over to France? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say it was November, early November.
And it was, what was the weather like?
I don't recall the weather. I think it was sort of rainy, and because I always recall there being a lot of mud around. So I think it may not have rained when we first got there, but it certainly rained shortly thereafter. It was their rainy season, and it hadn't gotten cold enough yet for the snow to come.
So where do you recall your first experience in actual battle?
I don't know, just listening to everybody here, I would say it was probably Herlisheim, but I'm not certain of that myself. I just remember moving up to the front and some other soldiers from some other unit, I suppose, maybe the 36th Infantry, coming back or vice versa. And I do remember this, that the unit that was coming back had a couple of German prisoners. And I remember when they came right pretty close passing us, they shot both of the prisoners. And I just thought that was kind of outrageous, but they apparently didn't want to take them back any further and just shot and killed them right there. And so we do have atrocities with our country as well as some other countries, I'm sure. But that was my first reaction.
So do you remember approximately where you were located in Herlisheim?
No, I don't know that. I do remember that it was as we were going in, at least this is the first experience I remember going into the battle there. It was probably later in the afternoon, and at that time we were following behind tanks, and the tanks were the lead force, and of course being behind the tanks you were being shielded from any small arms fire, and all of a sudden the tank commander indicated that he wanted somebody to do something. I apparently happened to be the closest one to it, and he indicated that the tanks were in danger because of either artillery or some anti-tank fire, and they thought it was from a pillbox that was probably, I'll say at least 3 football fields away, 900 to 1,000 yards away, and indicated to me that I should go and see if I can't knock out that pillbox. So the first thing I remember is, of course, getting on my belly and crawling out in that direction, not knowing what I would do when I get there. And the next thing I knew, I heard like a swish over my head, almost taking my helmet off, so I assume it was a shell going from maybe our tanks out that way and fairly close to the ground. And anyway, as I started crawling towards that pillbox, it began getting darker. And then as I looked around behind me, I saw many of our vehicles on fire, tanks, half-tracks, etc. Ultimately, I crawled to, there was a question now which way to go. So anyway, I continued crawling to the pillbox, and when I got to the pillbox, I couldn't hear anything. And if you look behind you, you still see some fires, but it looked like there wasn't any noise from either direction. And so it was getting cold. And so I went around to the side of the pillbox where the door is, and I started to open it. And it would, of course, go creak, and I wasn't sure what was inside, but I was so cold that I finally opened it and went inside, and there was nobody inside. And there were bed springs from cots laying there, I guess, where the German soldiers or whoever had occupied that pillbox would sleep, and there was nobody in there. So I closed the door, and I suppose at that time it was probably about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, being a winter time, and I was then had my M1 rifle just waiting at the door, expecting somebody to come in, and I suppose whoever it was, I would just have shot them, and they'd probably end up shooting me as well. And then and of course it was cold, you were shivering, and but I just would stay there the whole time. And then many hours later I heard some noise outside, and I figured it must be Germans, and I kept waiting for somebody to come in, but I'd hear this noise and nobody ever came in. And then as it got light later on in the morning, I opened the door slightly, and I could see it had snowed during the night, because here was the snow, and I could see blood on the snow. And as I went out further, what it was is some sheep. Sheep had gone there, and some sheep had gotten hurt, and that's what the bleeding was, and that's what the noise was. Ultimately, I walked out, and there was nothing around. Ultimately found a farmhouse, and ultimately, through those people, French people, found my way back to my unit. But that's my first experience I remembered in combat. Another experience would be we had a call for a night attack. We'll call it a dawn attack, really, where you probably start about 4 in the morning and begin moving towards the enemy lines, hoping to reach there by the time it's light. And of course, we were told that everything was radio silence. And so as we were moving forward out to what looked like a kind of a wooded area, moving towards wherever we were intended to go, all of a sudden the enemy artillery starts coming in. And of course the idea when you have artillery coming in is to move forward as fast as you can, because as you get closer to their lines, they're not going to drop the artillery anymore because it'll harm their soldiers as well as your own. So anyway, as that artillery started falling, there was one man in the platoon that was charged with carrying the radio. And it's what they call a SCR 300. It's a radio that's probably, I'd say 2 feet wide and maybe 2.5 feet long and maybe 6 inches wide, and you carry it on your back, at least all the guts of it. In those days, of course, they had batteries and they didn't have the circuitry, so you had kind of vacuum tubes in it, so they were big and bulky. And anyway, he was killed. And so the lieutenant of my platoon, Mr. Lieutenant Harrell, told me to get the radio. So I had to take the radio off of this guy's back and put it on mine. And while I'd had, I suppose, some training with the radio, I was not really that familiar with it. So I was playing around with it. So later on, after that battle was over and we went back to a rest area, the word came back that the company commander wanted to see me. And so I went back to another home in this little village where he was, and the first sergeant was down below, and the captain was upstairs in this house. And the first thing the first sergeant said is, I suppose they weren't, this first sergeant wasn't too well liked anyway, and he says, boy, you got your butt in a rut now because you broke radio silence. And I'm trying to say, well, how do you break radio silence if they're already bringing shells in? They know you're coming. What difference would it make? And so, and of course, the reason I was wanting to make sure the radio was operating properly is because you'd be getting some instructions on what to do from the higher up as to where you were supposed to go. So anyway, he said, the captain wants to see you. And that was Captain Powers. And I went up to see him, and of course I was just a private, you know, and shaking. And he starts to chew me out, and the first sergeant's there, and I don't know what he said, but then I said something that I'm sure would have sent me to the barracks, to the brig, I should say. And I said, you know, you listen to this first sergeant, he's a two-faced son of a bitch. He tells you one thing, he tells everybody something else. And the first sergeant says, don't you talk that way up here to that captain? And I said, well, you shut up. And anyway, the captain sent him back downstairs. And then I thought this was, you know, something really unusual. The captain then says, are you saying the men don't like me? And I said, no, they don't like you at all. And he said, well, that hurts me. He says, that's hurt me more than anything that ever happened in my life. He said, you know what I'd like you to do? He says, I'd like you, the next time we come to our rest area, would you come and tell me whether I'm changing? And I thought, my God, you know, I figured I'd be being sent to the military brig by that time. And so I thought I was a pretty big individual, you know, as I look back now on it. And anyway, then later on, apparently they were short of officers, and they were opening up an officers' candidate school in Fontainebleau, France. And it was going to be the first school, and I think they were going to have 100 people go to this OCS. And most of the people that were going to it apparently were coming from England that had been in the Air Force. And of course, the Air Force was part of the Army. And I guess they were getting kind of bored over there because much of the air war was over. They had now had that air superiority. So many of them, applied to see if they could go to that OCS school. And all of a sudden I get called one day from the company commander and said, I'm sending you to that OCS. And so after completing that, I came back to my same unit where I left as a private and then came back as an officer. And I feel that probably without that confrontation, I would not have been there. And so I thought that was somewhat unique.
And did you continue the updates with that captain? As far as his
I never
progress
did,
or-
no, because right after that was, shortly after that is when I got the call to go to OCS, and I really never had much to do with him after that. Because when I came back, the war was just about over, and everybody split up and went to different type units. So.
Wow, what an experience. What do you remember on the day that they said that the war was over? Where were you?
I think everybody was happy, and I think what the concern of everybody is where are we going now? And the rumor was to many people they're going to be relocating you and sending you to the Pacific, and others got the word they were going to go to the 4th Armored Division, and ultimately I was, not shortly thereafter, was sent to a construction engineering battalion, and their job primarily was to find all these bunkers that the Germans had and blow them up, any underground factories, blow them up, and any kind of large weapons to disable them. And this was the first time that I'd had any experience with explosives, which now are used here to blow up buildings, what they call impulsion instead of explosion. Implosion blows them up inside, and that's what we would do with these factories and these bunkers that the Germans had, so they would collapse inside rather than blow things all over. And that was, I think, sort of a technique that had been developed by the British, and of course we use it now throughout the whole world.
So you didn't go directly home. You went into Army of Occupation.
Yeah, I did. I went to this engineering battalion.
And how long do you think you were there?
Well, I would say probably 6 months, and being there, I learned a lot of things that I otherwise wouldn't learn. I didn't need to do it for myself because being an officer, I wasn't required to do that. But I learned, to operate the graders and the all sorts of construction type equipment. And some of it I realized what coordination it takes, particularly where you have those shovels you have to lift and move this way and that way. And so I always felt that was kind of a plus to be able to learn to use that type of equipment.
Did you have any involvement with concentration camps or POWs?
When I didn't have that because I wasn't with them when I was back at Fontainebleau, France, when they went into Landsberg with the concentration camp there, so I didn't see that.
What about any other association with the local people? Did you have make any friends with the French or no?
I didn't, and I didn't realize they had this association until probably very recent years here. I don't know why, I just never heard of it. And so a lot of the people that I probably serve right next to that I see here, I don't recognize their faces too well, I don't recognize their names. They seem to recognize me more than I seem to recognize them, but it's obviously we were, in the same squads probably even. But, and then just recently, I got a letter from somebody who said he served right next to me and sent me some pictures, but he's apparently never been active in the association, but he must get some literature on it because he saw my name and wrote me this letter and said, it's been 50 years since I've heard your name. And I brought those pictures here to show to other people to see if they recognized him. And they didn't recognize the picture, but most of them said, yeah, I've heard the name before. So, well, I don't have a lot more to say.
What did you do after the war?
After the war, I went, of course, used the GI Bill and went back to college and got my BA degree at UCLA. About that time, I married, and I started doing mostly selling. In fact, I went to work for Procter & Gamble, and I see that Cincinnati is where their main office is out here. And I worked as a salesperson for a number of years, and then my wife said, you know, why don't you do something else? And so I ultimately went back to UCLA and went to law school. And so I've been a lawyer since '56. So, and have my own law practice. I had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, and all of them are lawyers. I now have a grandchild. The oldest grandchild is, I don't know, probably 20, 21, and he just enrolled for law school. So, and I didn't push any of them into it. So,
what area of law do you cover?
well, I was in a smaller town, so, well, I shouldn't say that. Originally, I started with the County of Los Angeles, which was a rather small group, but doing mostly trial work with eminent domain. In other words, where they were acquiring roads and areas for new courthouses, you know, all kinds of public buildings. And, but when I left them after 4.5 years and opened my own practice, I had kind of a general practice, so I've done everything. I feel comfortable in anything, whether I'm doing family law, criminal law, business litigation, corporate, probate, whatever it happens to be. Recently, we've gotten out of the family law, but and lately, then I do mostly now a lot of arbitrations, mediations, and that sort of thing.
So will you ever retire, or is this something?
Probably not. Probably not. I go in every day at 7 o'clock and stay till 6 o'clock. And I enjoy the law, and so it's not something that I'm apt to walk away from. I, look at my neighborhood where people have retired at 65 or something, and it seems about all you ever see them doing is walking around the block, and it seemed to me like it would be kind of boring after a few weeks of it. And I suppose retirement has the effect that now I got to watch my money, so I can't travel, and so what's the point of doing it then? But all right, any other questions?
No, not right off. If there's anything else you wanted to mention, whether it was a good experience, you enjoyed it, or
Well, I'm astounded that this division has been that active, and I don't know of any other division that's that way, whether it be armored or otherwise. And you talk to all kinds of people my age who've all been in the military, and once they got out, that was the last they ever had any association with it. And so it's really a strange thing. Oh, I do have one story. It's not related to the 12th Armored. Actually, you asked me what I did when I got out, and I guess I missed something. After I got my Bachelor of Arts degree in college, I decided to go back in the service. And what happened was the service at that time had a program in which you would become regular Army. See, anybody who's an officer in the Army from the war and so forth is called Army of the United States. And the only people that are regular Army are those that graduate from West Point. And of course, unless you're regular Army, there's not much chance of moving up in the hierarchy. Well, anyway, they offered a program that if you qualified for it, you could become regular Army. And what the program was primarily is you would ultimately serve under 4 different commanders at probably 3 or 4 months each. And then based upon whatever recommendation those commanders gave, determine whether they might then give you that regular Army status. So I went back in I guess it would be January of 1950. And then they first sent me to the armored school for about a 6-week program to learn all about tanks and the vehicles and so forth. So as an officer, you'd know what to do. And then I served under the first commander, which was at Fort Meade, Maryland, and it was the facility for the 1st Armored Cavalry, and would have a lot of new recruits that would be under me and so forth. Well, anyway, what happened ultimately is we were out on the mortar range firing these 80-millimeter mortars, and after you finish an exercise, then you go through the area where you drop the mortar shells and you look for any live rounds, and you mark them so the demolition people could come out and blow them up. Well, anyway, I went out there in the Jeep with my Jeep driver, and looking at the field where these shells had been fired, and all of a sudden my Jeep driver picks up one of them and says, "What do we do with this?" And I said, "Holy cow, set that back down." And he drops it, and it blows up, and threw me up in the sky, and I was out, and he was killed, and I was sent then to a field hospital, and ultimately they had to amputate my leg, and so that really kind of put an end to the career. And although I did stay in even for maybe 6 months or so after getting out of the hospital, in fact, I was then sent to Fort MacArthur, California, and, but ultimately I could see that that wasn't going to take me any place, and I finally left. So.
Were you injured in the war at all?
No, the only thing I recall there is just I didn't go to medics for anything. Is that kind of that frostbite stuff? It was so cold out there, but I didn't get any injuries from any other weapons or anything.
That's amazing. You go through the whole war, and then afterwards, that's
Yeah.
what hurt.
So anyway, that's about all I can tell you.
Thank you, Robert.
All right.
We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay.
Okay.